So, currently reporting from the city in which I played my first ever poker live stream about 2 years ago now. It's nice to be back. Right, so this is Austin, Texas, a place we've been to before on the vlog, I think 3 or 4 times now. And once again, I'm here to play on the Lodge Card Club live stream. Things have definitely evolved there. When I first played on this stream, it was a 5-5 game, I believe, and it was like a small organization. Now, as you guys, I'm sure know, Andrew Nemi, Brad Owen, and Doug Polk have all bought the property, and since then it's blown up, both in quality, traffic, and all things alike. So I'm back today, but not for some 5-5. Instead, for some 10-25, I believe. Actually, that's wrong. 25-50, which will likely turn into a 25-50-100. So quite a big game. One thing I've noticed, in fact, like the main difference I've noticed between the LA live streams I've been playing and the one here at the Lodge is it's a lot more competitive here. It doesn't seem to be as gambling oriented, I should say, as some of the LA streams. You know, a lot of these guys are very competent poker players, and my goal this live stream is to not make a fool of myself. Without any further ado, let's go over some 25, 50, 100 hands. Alright guys, here we go again, this time playing 25-50, which was pretty much a 25-50-100 the entire time. I decided to sit with $34,000. I know, kind of an odd amount, but either way, here we go. Starting off the night with this first hand where action folds all the way to Jake, who raises it up to $250. Small blind folds, and then the big blind Adam puts in a raise to $1,000. Yours truly is in the $100 straddle, and I'm looking down at King 4 suited. Typically not really a hand you'd want to get involved with already so much action ahead, but when you consider the positions here, Jake is opening on the button, so that could be all sorts of hands, and Adam could know that and as such be taking advantage by raising a little wide himself. So I think a suited king is a decent candidate to occasionally combat these things going on. Like I said, not something I would do very often, in fact, pretty rarely, but this is one of those times. I'm in position against Adam, I'm expecting Jake to fold. Let's go. I put in another raise to $2,300. Unfortunately, as you guys can see, Jake's actually got a real hand here in pocket jacks, and with only $10,000 in his stack, he decides to rip it in there. Adam folds his King Queen suited, and of course with King 4, I also have to let it go. Not a very good start, losing over $2,000 trying to take the adventurous route, but more often than not, I would expect Jake to fold whatever he opens on the button, and then we play heads up in position against Adam. You know, it's a situation in which I like my chances, but this time it does not happen, and we're in the hole right away. In the next interesting hand, there's an open from high to 250. Doug Polk calls in middle position, and then the button and small blind call as well. I'm in the big blind looking down at 7-6 suited. Typically not a hand that I want to squeeze with. I think I'm happy to just call and go multi-way. But this time, considering that high had been playing a lot of hands and there's a lot of dead money to try to take down if we can, I think there is incentive to raising it up and trying to represent a strong hand. So that's what I'm doing this time by kicking it up to 1450. The initial raiser folds, which is a good sign, but Doug Polk decides to call again, and everyone else folds. So we're going to go heads up out of position versus Doug to a flop of Queen 7-3 with 2 spades, no club. Decent, I guess. We've got middle pair, but after the pre-flop action, I don't expect it to be best all too often. However, I think all my hands want to bet small here regardless of what I have, so that's what I do. $1,100 into the middle, and Doug doesn't think too long before calling. So at this point, I think we could be behind, but could also have the best hand after he calls a really small bet. It's not necessarily cause for concern just yet, and especially so when we see the 6 of diamonds on the turn. Does introduce a second flush draw though. So what do we want to do here? Well, obviously I've got 2 cards that match 2 cards on the flop. So of course betting seems totally reasonable, but against a player like Doug, I think analyzing a little deeper makes sense. And when you think about this particular card, it's generally going to favor him a lot more than me. He's going to have more straights, more 2 pairs, more sets. So I think we would want to check a lot of over pairs and even perhaps a queen. Doing it with middle 2 pairs seems logical as well. So that's what I decide to do this time. Unfortunately, Doug checks it back. This is usually an indication of some sort of showdown value, I think. I feel like if he had any sort of draw or if he floated the flop with anything, he'd probably want to start bluffing now. So when he checks back, I think he's got something. But when the river comes to deuce of spades completing the flush, I still don't really see any sense in betting. It feels like there's more value in checking and letting Doug either value bet a worse hand or bluff with maybe a hand that didn't want to stab on the turn. I'm also thinking about hands I would play in this fashion, and if I had a flush draw, it would be unlikely that I bet on the flop and then checked on the turn. So I think Doug knows that, and he could capitalize on that if I were to bet. So with all those things in mind, I decide to check it again. As you guys can see, there was really no value in betting anyway, as it's unlikely Doug would call any amount with pocket eights. So he checks it back quickly, and we take it down. Shortly after that, this hand comes up where Gator Wade raises blind from late position to 250, then it gets to me on the button with Jack 10. Against any 2 random cards in position, these are some very good cards, so I raise it up to $800 and he calls. So we're going to go heads up to a flop against, well, I have no idea what he's got. But anyway, we flop a straight draw and it's a decent board for us with a queen out there. So with that in mind, when he checks, I continue with a small bet and he calls. We get some help on the turn as the Jack of Spades arrives, but interestingly enough, now Gator Wade decides to lead out for a pot-sized bet of $2,700. Really weird spot now. I feel like it's unlikely he's playing a bluff this way, but at the same time, would he really play a strong hand this way either? I actually have no idea. I've never played with this guy before. In fact, I've never even met him until about an hour ago, so not sure what to do. Having the 10 of spades is not very exciting because if he had some sort of straight draw or flush draw that he wanted to bluff with, having the 10 of spades is not good for me since, I'd want him to have that card. But we also have some outs with a 9. I don't know. Weird situation, but against an unknown in a close situation, I decide to just let it go. After a few hours, it would become apparent that this was probably not the best play since he ended up playing a ton of hands very aggressively. And as you guys can see, this was one of those as he's got 4 high. So gotta respect the effort from Gator Wade. Later on, this hand comes up where Cinnabon raises from early position with ace-king suited. Please don't make me say that name again. Gator Wade calls in the small blind, and I look down at 9-8 suited in the straddle. I call as well, so 3 of us are going to a flop, which is a good one. 8-7-4 with 2 diamonds. I've got top pair. Small blind checks. I check it. Initial raiser checks it back. Turns decent. It's a 7 of hearts. Gator checks again. This time I decide to bet small. Initial raiser folds, and Gator calls. So feeling like we've got the best hand now. And then we see an interesting river, the 9 of hearts. This card introduces a possible flush as well as, I guess, some possible straights. Well, not really. Those were there beforehand. But anyway, even though I've got top 2 pair, I still think this is a thin value situation because despite our hand being decently strong, what are we really targeting with a bet here? Feels unlikely he would call with a worse hand, but that's okay. I'm willing to live with the consequences of betting here for value. Don't want to go too big though since I'm not representing either a bluff or a very good hand. So I put in $600, and as you guys can see, he's got bottom pair, so wouldn't blame him for calling since there are quite a few draws that completely bricked. But he does eventually fold, and we win a small pot. I was still pretty happy with my river bet though. Back in the day, I used to be afraid of getting check raised if I was going to bet for thin value, but nowadays, I feel more mentally prepared to cross that bridge when it comes. Anyway, enough gibberish on the nothingness of that hand. In this next one, once again, Gator opens in early position, and I'm looking down at Jack 10. Not really a great hand, could probably just fold this most of the time, but if I were to enter the pot, I'd want it to be with a raise since it's not strong enough to just call. So that's what I do this time, bump it up to 800, and he calls. Flop is good, 10-4 deuce with 2 hearts, so we've got top pair on a board where we're often going to be bluffing. For that reason, when he checks, I continue with a bet of $800. And of course, get check raised by a very capable and aggressive player to $2,500. I was somewhat anticipating this as I bet the flop, so here we go. Time to hang on and hope for a clean run out. I put in the money and we don't get a good turn card. It's the Queen of Hearts, and he continues with a bet of $3,400. Now, a lot of hands that we were beating on the flop, such as flush draws or perhaps hands like King Queen or Queen Jack that just decide to play aggressively, have now improved, and that's just if I was ahead on the flop. Could have easily been beat already, so knowing full well I might be getting bluffed once again, I decide to make a somewhat conservative fold against this player type, and thank God I did because he flopped middle set with pocket fours, so we avoid some disaster there. And kind of get bailed out by that turn card. Didn't look great at first, but it was actually my saving grace. Next, this hand comes up where early position opens to 300, and once again I'm looking down at a hand that should mostly get folded, but probably re-raised some frequency of the time, and that is Queen Jack offsuit. Like I said in the previous hand, it's not really strong enough to just call, so I do decide to play it aggressively this time, make it $1,000 to go, and only the initial raiser calls. We go to a flop of Ace 8-4 with 2 clubs. Pretty terrible for my exact hand, but I could have a bunch of hands that connect with this board, such as any ace or perhaps pocket eights. So with that in mind, I continue with a small bet. Sadly, Adam calls. At this point, I think it's obvious he's got at least a pair. So when the turn comes to 9 of diamonds, I'm not really interested in trying to get him off an ace. This player in particular had been playing fairly tight so far, so I decide to just shut it down. River comes to 9 of clubs. He checks it a third time. Once again, close, I think, between trying to bluff or just checking it back and giving up. As you guys can see, my opponent is standing in this hand, and that's because we were in the middle of a stand-up round. If you guys aren't familiar, it means the last person standing gives everyone else a bounty, and the only way to sit back down is to win a pot. So with that added factor, I feel like it's very likely we're going to get called if I attempt a bluff. Unfortunately, after I check it back, he shows me a 4 for bottom pair on the flop, so we end up losing in a very embarrassing fashion, as probably any bet would have got the job done. But then again, you never know. This is Texas, and these guys like to put money in the middle. But yeah, this one does not go our way, and looking back, there's a few things I wish I would have done differently. Just add it to the catalog of hands in which I've embarrassed myself on YouTube. Moving right along, in this next hand, I've got King Deuce of Diamonds. Once again playing the stand-up game. This was a new round, however, so now I'm standing up looking to sit down. Good enough for a raise. I make it 600 as the double straddle was on, and only the double straddler defends, which in this case is Mr. Doug Polk. Heads up to a flop of 8-5-4 with 2 spades. Nothing out there for me, and just a bad board in general for the pre-flop raiser, so I decide to check it back, and we get no help on the turn as the 8 of hearts arrives. Now, a player like Doug is very aware of situations like this, and he knows that he can just bet liberally with almost all his hands here. So when he bets around 1/3 the size of the pot, considering that we're still beating a good amount of air balls, I make a very optimistic call. Sure, we could be behind all sorts of hands, such as Queen 4 offsuit, for example, but with the added factor of getting to sit down if I somehow win this hand, I decide to make the speculative call, and we see another 5 on the river. If he bets again, I'm very likely going to call, but when he checks, I decide to just take my showdown value and check it back. Turns out King High is good, but only because I got lucky, as his pair of 4s is counterfeit by the board, and we win this one, earning our seat and avoiding losing this round of stand-up. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, we move to the most interesting hand of this night. Early position opens to $500, Gator Wade once again. I'm in late position looking down at King Queen offsuit. Against someone who's been playing a bunch of hands, I think this is a very clear re-raise, so that's what I do, kicking it up to 1,700. And things get a little bit interesting here as the small blind, high, decides to cold call my raise, but the pre-flop raiser folds. Not really what I was expecting, but that's quite alright as we're going to go in position to a decent board for me. It's Ace 6-5 with 2 clubs. Obviously, my exact hand has pretty much nothing going on, aside from, I guess, backdoor flush and straight draws, but let's be honest, those never come in anyway. But there is an ace out there, and since I re-raised pre-flop, should have no problem representing that across future streets. So, when he checks it over to me, I'm going to start with a small bet, just like if I did have something good, but my opponent is undeterred and makes the call. Turn card is decent, it's the deuce of clubs, and I think my opponent is almost never going to have a flush in this situation, and I say that for a few different reasons. Number one, he just cold called pre-flop. Seems unlikely he would do that with a lot of suited hands. More likely he's got something like pocket queens through pocket eights, for example. You know, hands that just want to see a flop. Maybe sometimes he'll have something like ace jack or ace 10. And all those hands, I think, are going to have a hard time hanging on with some continued aggression. You could also make the case that I wouldn't have a flush super often, but definitely more often than my opponent. And I've got the queen of clubs, so, you know, a hope and a prayer. With all that in mind, when he checks again, I decide to bet $4,500, just like if I had a flush or two pair, even pocket aces, I would be doing the same. I'm expecting this to work fairly often, but unfortunately, my opponent calls once again. Not looking good at this point. We definitely could use some help in the form of a club, but it's the 7 of spades. For a third time, my opponent checks it over to me, and now we've got a decision to make. He's got around $19,000 remaining in his stack, so essentially a pot-sized bet, and now I've got to decide whether I want to shut it down or go for glory. Well, as boring as it sounds, I think the decision has absolutely nothing to do with emotions or how bad I want it or anything like that, but it's more so just about the facts of the hand. And if we think about this exact spot, it's very unlikely he's going to have a strong hand. And what I mean by that is I've got a king and a queen, so him having ace king and ace queen seems less likely. I know, not impossible, but you get what I'm saying. And I've got a club myself, which makes it less likely he's got a flush. And even if he did have a flush, he'd probably check raise the turn. So when you consider all these things, I think the most likely hand we're up against is either a pocket pair that calls the turn because he has a club, or a hand like ace jack, ace 10, ace 9 suited, you know, hands of that nature that are really hoping I check it back. So of course, I'm not going to do that. If I had a flush or even a set, two pair, etc., I would definitely be betting for value. So with a hand like king queen with a club, I'll definitely be doing the same thing, except obviously it's not for value. I think about it for a little bit and eventually decide the best play is to rip it all in there and cross my fingers.
High's really going to have to put his hero pants on to make this call.
Corey, did we get the game out of the muck?
I'd say that worked, Corey.
Oh, he's already sitting down. Brutal.
Yeah, we don't get to see it till later.
Kai does get out of the way. Mariano's going to take it down. Nicely played from him with the 3-bet pre-flop and the bet on the flop. Pure aggression for the poker vlogger. Takes down that pot, profiting around $9,000.
So, after a few painful seconds, my opponent eventually decides to fold. Close call, but happy to get this one through, and we win the biggest pot of the night with king high. Not bad. And with that, we move to the last interesting hand for myself of this particular stream. In this one, the double straddle is onto 200, and I opened 7-4 suited from middle position. Definitely questionable, but you guys already know that. Luckily, I only get called by the double straddler, so playing in position, and I've got a pretty snug image. Only good things can happen, right? King 9-7, 2 clubs. Another mediocre flop for me. It feels like all night I haven't been connecting too hard, but that's alright. No reason we can't win this one anyway. He checks, I bet small, and he calls. Turn is no help, it's the queen of diamonds. This time when he checks, I decide to check it back with a small amount of showdown value with bottom pair. And we finally connect very well on today's stream as another 7 comes on the river, giving me a fairly disguised 3 of a kind. Even better news is that my opponent's got top pair. However, I would expect he checks this hand more often than not. Luckily, he does not this time. Instead, he leads out for over a pot-sized bet, $2,500. Against this sort of sizing, I don't really see any value in raising. It feels like only a stronger hand is going to call. I mean, I guess you could make the case that perhaps he convinces himself to call with a king, maybe, but more often than not, I think it's not a good idea to raise against such big sizings with 3 of a kind. So anyway, I make the call, and we end up winning an over $7,000 pot to end the evening. And like I said, that was a wrap for myself. I didn't really get into any more interesting spots. So as always, I hope you guys enjoyed the hands. Right, so as you guys saw, things went all right for myself, but not a whole lot of action. I felt like I never really made any huge hands, but that's okay because I ended up being in for 34,000. I added 20, so a total of 54,000, cashed out for almost $10,000 more than that. As per usual, you guys will see the results right here, but yeah, all in all, I can't complain about winning a good amount of money, but given the size of the game, it's not like anything crazy impressive. Like always, I had a great time here at the lodge. Everyone is so friendly, the staff are great, the live stream is awesome, so I'll definitely be back. One thing I don't like though is how many insects are around this city, especially this time of year. It's just so hot and humid. That's one thing I definitely don't enjoy, but anyway, that's a wrap for today, guys. As always, thanks for watching, thanks for the support, and until next time, good luck at the tables. See you guys later, Austin. Peace.